Today's class is the 19th and, sad to say, the final session in our series, introductory series on evangelism and apologetics. And today we're going to finish, Lord willing, listening to the great debate between Dr. Gordon Stein and Dr. Greg Bonson. Remember to jot down questions and comments that you have as we're going through it. As I said a couple of Sundays ago when we first started listening to it, it's the premier demonstration of Christian apologetics in practice, in my opinion. And for those of you who were not present last week, raise your hand if you weren't here last week. Just a couple, three. Okay. We stopped the audio file after Greg Bonson's second opening statement, and today we're going to resume the debate with Dr. Stein cross-examining Dr. Bonson. The cross-examinations, if you've not listened to debates, are always the most profitable, in my opinion. Maybe they're the most entertaining. Ephesians 5:11 through 17. The Apostle Paul said, "Do not participate in the unfruitful deeds of darkness, but instead even expose them. For it is disgraceful even to speak of the things which are done by them in secret. But all things become visible when they are exposed by the light, for everything that becomes visible is light. For this reason it says, 'Awake, sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you.' Therefore be careful how you walk, not as unwise men, but as wise, making the most of your time, because the days are evil. So then, don't be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is." Again, that was Ephesians 5. The New Living Translation translates verse 16 as make the most of every opportunity in these evil days. And so part of doing that is deciding what you're going to read in life. There's, as I've said before, a glut of books in the world today, most of which would be better off serving as kindling, I think. So it's very, very important deciding how you spend your time reading. I think everything on this resource list is worthy of your time. And speaking of time, we simply don't have enough of it this morning for me to provide even the briefest commentary on these books. And so if you have questions about them, please see me afterwards to discuss them. Keep in mind the checklist for arguing with unbelievers. Can anyone give me one point of the checklist that we've talked about? When you're reasoning with an unbeliever, what's something you want to keep in mind as they're speaking to you? Well, I have... Pardon? Okay, they're presuppositions. That would be point 2 in that checklist for arguing with unbelievers. They're going to be saying things from an unargued philosophical bias or a set of presuppositions. And you want to be able to capture those, yes. That was the first thing that I said, 80% of your time as a Christian apologist. 80% is not statistically based, but just from my experience and listening to others debate, you're going to spend most of your time pointing out arbitrariness in the claims of your unbeliever, unfounded statements. And then the third point was dialectic tensions or incongruous presuppositions within their thinking. And then lastly, you want to point out the failure of the unbeliever's worldview to provide the preconditions for the intelligibility of human experience. And then the two broad steps to opposing or comparing opposing worldviews were doing an internal critique of the worldview, and then secondly, setting forth the Christian worldview. Okay? So if you don't get anything else from the series, please try to memorize those 4 points of the checklist for arguing with unbelievers, and then also those 2 broad steps for comparing opposing worldviews. And with that, we'll begin the debate, and afterwards, if we have... Yes?
Tony, what was number 3 again? I have a blank there.
The third point of the checklist?
So the dialectical tensions or incongruous.
Presuppositions. Yeah. Dialectic tensions, things that just don't go together. Okay.
Which? Theistic. Theistic? Christian theistic.
If you've got the full transcript from that website I think I sent to everyone. This is page 25. That's what we'll be starting
No
on.
other worldview can account for universal and variant.
So you can back up about 30 seconds.
Do you think it's fair, since you pointed out that logicians
Or a
themselves
minute.
are in great disagreement about the nature of the laws of logic, to ask me, in atheist universe, what are the laws
That's
of
good.
logic?
So here he's finishing his second opening statement.
Invariant, and how does an atheist justify the use of them? Are they merely conventions imposed on our experience, or are they something that reflect absolute truth? Dr. Stein tonight has wanted to use the laws of logic. I want to suggest to you one more time that Dr. Stein, in so doing, is borrowing my worldview. He's using the Christian approach to the world so that there can be such laws of logic, scientific inference, or what have you, but then he wants to deny the very foundation of it.
Thank you, Dr. Bonson. Dr. Stein, you now have an opportunity to cross-examine Dr. Bonson. This will last 4 minutes.
Is mathematics either atheistic or theistic? Foundations of mathematics, yes. Which? Theistic. Theistic? Christian theistic. How do you figure that? From the impossibility of the contrary, no other worldview can justify the laws of mathematics or of logic, because no other worldview can account for universal and variant abstract entities such as them. Do you think it's fair, since you pointed out that logicians themselves are in great disagreement about the nature of the laws of logic, to ask me to explain them in a way that you would find satisfactory? Yes, it's fair. Why? Because this is a rational debate about worldviews. You have a naturalistic worldview, I have a supernaturalistic one. I want something even beginning to be an answer of how a naturalist can justify a universal abstract entity. I haven't heard one yet. Okay, is logic based upon mathematics? No. Never? Not symbolic logic, for example? No. I would disagree with you. Well, if we want to get into Russell and Whitehead and debate those issues, we'd be glad to do that. But if you ask a simple question, I can only give you a simple answer. You said that... Assume the opposite. As far as I'm concerned, as a Christian, I'm not committed one way or another to that. If you want to say mathematical laws and the permutation laws of math are the same as those used in logic, that's fine. How do you justify either one of them is my question. Well, I would ask you a more fundamental question, that is, you explained that the laws of logic reflect the thinking of God. Number one, how do you know this? And number two, what does it mean? What difficulty are you having understanding what does it mean? I don't know how you were privy to the thinking of God. He revealed himself through the scriptures of the Old and New Testament. And that explains the logic. That explains logic. That explains why there are universal standards of reasoning. Yes. It doesn't explain them to me. Could you explain them again? Yeah, we have Bible studies from time to time where those things can be delved into. You mean you spend some time rationalizing the irreconcilable, or reconciling the irreconcilable? No, that's just, like the two accounts in Genesis, the two pedigrees of... This is a cross-examination. If you have something other than a rhetorical question, I'll try to answer it. Well, it's not intended as a rhetorical question. It's intended as... The previous one was rhetorical only. No, it was intended to show that your last statement was disingenuous and
Please limit your comments to questions.
Yes, okay. Saying that logic reflects the thinking of God is to make a non-statement. How is that an answer to anything that's relevant in this discussion? It answers the general metaphysical issue of how there can be universal invariant abstract entities in a particular person's worldview. If you want to know the precise relationship, for instance, if somebody wants to know how did God make a cow, okay, the statement that God made the cow has meaning apart from my being able to explain the mechanics of God making a cow. Likewise, the statement that the laws of logic are intelligible within a Christian theistic universe has meaning because there are things which are, in fact, spiritual, immaterial, and have a universal quality, such as God's thinking and those standards that he imposes on people. And so, again, we can at least metaphysically make sense of invariant abstract entities in one universe, whereas we can't make sense of them at all in the other. We're not asking for the mechanics here, or anything precise such as resolving the relationship of logic to math and that sort of thing. I'm simply asking a more general question. If you're an atheist, how in the atheist universe is it possible to have an abstract universal law?
Thank you, Dr. Stein. Dr. Bonson, you now have a 4-minute opportunity to cross-examine Dr. Stein.
Hey, Dr. Stein, you made reference to David Hume and his rejection of miracles. Have you also read David Hume in his discussion of induction, or more popularly, the uniformity of nature?
A long time ago. I can't recall exactly what he said. I have read David Hume.
All right.
Were
you convinced a long time ago that you had an answer to Hume's skepticism about induction?
Can't answer that question honestly. I don't remember this was at least 15 years ago that I read this.
The validity of scientific laws were undermined by Hume when he contended that we have no rational basis for expecting the future to be like the past, or if you will, for there to be types of events, so that one event happening can be understood as a type of event, so where it's seen happening somewhere else, the same consequence can be expected from similar causation. Hume said we had no rational basis for that.
Can we have a question, please, for Dr. Stein?
Yeah, I'm trying to set up the question. Hume suggested that there was no rational basis for expecting the future to be like the past, in which case science is based simply on convention, or if you will, habits of thought. Do you agree with Hume?
Not on this issue, I don't.
Do you now have an answer for Hume?
I think he was wrong about that one thing, but he was also right about a lot of other things. Nobody's perfect.
What is the basis for the uniformity of nature?
I went through this, but I'll be glad to reiterate it.
Okay.
The uniformity of nature comes from the fact that matter has certain properties which it regularly exhibits. It's part of the nature of matter. Electrons, oppositely charged things attract, the same charges repel. There are certain valences that can fill up the shell of an atom, and that's as far as it can combine.
Do all electrons repel each other?
If they're within a certain distance of each other, yes.
Have you tested all electrons?
All electrons that have ever been tested repel each other. I have not tested all.
Have you read all the tests on electrons?
Me personally, or can I go on the witness of experts?
Have you read all of the witnesses?
Sorry.
Thank you. We will now move to rebuttals. Dr. Stein, 6-minute rebuttal, please.
Can you pause that? In my transcript, there's a section of the audio file that's not present. Anybody else see that? So, Dr. Bonson asked, have you read all the witnesses about electrons? Stein says, all it takes is one witness to say no. And it will be on the front pages of every physics journal, and there are none, so I'd say in effect yes. Bonson says, well, physicists have their own presuppositions by which they exclude contrary evidence too. In other words, you haven't experienced all the electrons, but you would generalize that all the electrons under certain conditions repel each other. Stein responds, just statistically on the basis of past observation. Bonson says, but we don't know that it's going to be that way 10 minutes after this debate then. Stein says, but we see no evidence that things have switched around, do we? Bonson says, do you accept the Zen Buddhist logic that allows for cones, the different kind of logic that you referred to, which is used by Zen Buddhists? Stein says, I'd use the word extra-logical. It's outside the normal kinds of logic. It's not necessarily a different kind of logic, but it's just non-logical, accepted in place of logic. Bonson says, are extra-logical things absurd? Stein says, they may seem that way to us, but I would say, no, they aren't absurd in the grand scheme of things. Remember, grand scheme. Bonson says, can claims about extra-logical matters be true? Stein says that's impossible to answer because if we're using logic to answer if something is true or not, then extra-logical things are not something in the analysis of logic. Bonson says, are claims about extra-logical entities allowed or disallowed in your worldview? And Stein says, it depends on what we're talking about. If we're talking about things like Zen Buddhism and they confine themselves to these philosophical speculations, then yes. If you're talking about science, then no. And at least at that point, Stein, I think, is being consistent. He's restricting those certain laws of logic to the particular worldview, Zen Buddhism, that's using them. Bonson says that sounds very arbitrary, and it is. So, go ahead. This is the rebuttal. Is it too loud for everybody?
Make one little factual rebuttal about a statement that was slipped by in the first speech of Dr. Bonson that atheists caused the French Revolution. This was a false statement. The leader of the French Revolution, the most important person, was Robespierre, who was a Christian. So, I mean, there may have been some atheists there, but that doesn't mean that they caused the French Revolution. There are atheists everywhere. Okay, now, we've spent a lot of time talking about logic, and yet I'd like to know why, and this is not a question that's addressed right now for an answer, but just as a put out for a future response, why has Dr. Bonson stressed the laws of logic so much when he's refused to apply them to the existence of God? I'm not so sure that it's even falsifiable, so therefore it isn't even a statement that can be tested in any way. He has stressed the laws of logic because he knows that there's no explanation for the laws of logic that philosophers agree upon. This is a trap, in effect. I may have fallen into it. If so, fine. The point is, it's not relevant to his position. To say he doesn't have an answer to the laws of logic either. To say that they reflect the thinking of a God is to make a non-statement. First of all, he doesn't know what the thinking of a God is. All he knows is what has been said by men to be what they thought the thinking of a God might have been many, many years ago. Maybe, if we keep granting all the possible things in his favor. It's like saying, as I said before, that God created the universe. Unless you explain how he created it, you have not made a statement that has any intrinsic value to it. I mean, you may have made a part of the statement, but I want to hear the other half. What is there in the method that God used that we can learn something from? I mean, why did God do it? If you want to be a little bit more nasty, it's not valid to ask science why something happens. You can ask how it happens, but science doesn't try and answer the question why. But theologians, do ask the question why and try and answer it. I have not heard an answer as to why God did anything that he supposedly did, nor have I heard how God did it. These are the two most essential, meaningful answers to asking a question. If we don't supply those, we have ducked the whole center of the issue and just given you another mumbling which doesn't go anywhere. I'll give you an example. If I said, how did that car that's parked in the parking lot, that red car right in front, how did it get here? And you say, General Motors made it. That does not explain how the car got here. Now, if you want to go and explain that in Detroit, 100 men worked a certain number of hours to make this car out of steel that they got from Youngstown, Ohio, from a smelting plant, and then maybe we're getting somewhere as to how that car got here. I don't mean how it got on the Irvine campus. I mean how you get here in existence. So, until we have that kind of an answer, we have not said anything. To say that General Motors made it is not answering the question of how that car got here. Neither is there an answer to say that God made it. And I would ask Dr. Bonson to explain, if he thinks he knows the answer, which none of these philosophers know about the laws of logic, to put his answer in some kind of meaningful language. To say that the laws of logic reflect the thinking of God is to make a non-meaningful statement. And not just to me, to anyone. I want to know whether God thinks rationally all the time, whether he can be irrational. How do we know when he's being irrational? Is it possible for him to be irrational? I want to know what kind of logic God uses. Does he use the kind of logic that we can demonstrate, that we can test in the same way that we use the logic that we're talking about in science? If so, Should it be impossible for God to contradict himself in any way? Can he make a stone so big he can't lift it? Is that a logical impossibility? Is God limited by that kind of a thing? Can God make a square circle? I mean, these are little logical games that we play that don't really ask important questions, but they have a reflection on some kind of a problem that he is having with his concept of God. That if God can do anything, if he's omnipotent and omniscient and omnibenevolent, can he do those two things I said, or asked? And if he does, what kind of logic is he using? The logic of self-contradiction? Until we have some answers to these questions, I don't think we've got very much meaningful from Dr. Bonson in the first place about any issue. He certainly hasn't applied logic to the proofs of the existence of God that have been offered by philosophers.
Thank you, Dr. Stein. Dr. Bonson, you now have 6 minutes allocated for your rebuttal.
Right. Dr. Stein has demonstrated, it seems to me repeatedly in the course of tonight's debate, the claim that was made very early on in my original statement, and that's that the atheist worldview cannot give an account of those things which are necessary for rational discourse or science. When asked about Hume and the skepticism that he generated about induction or the uniformity of nature, we don't hear an answer coming forth. I don't think there will be an answer coming forth from the atheist worldview. However, Dr. Stein, who is an atheist, has said, and I think this is close to a quote, if there were no uniformity, science would be impossible. Exactly, Dr. Stein. If there were no uniformity, science would be impossible. So on what basis in an atheist universe is science possible? Since in an atheist universe, there's no basis for assuming that there's going to be uniformity. For someone to say, well, it's been that way in all the cases in the past that we know of, and therefore very probably it's going to be that way in the future, is to assume, because you're using probability, that the future is going to be like the past. That is to say, is to beg the very question that's being asked you. Now, of course, if you don't like the tough philosophical questions that are asked you about the nature of laws of logic, how they are justified, the nature of natural law, how it is justified, and so forth, and just dismiss it as absurd questions or non-questions that no one understands and does not have meaning, seems to me it's just to try to give medicine to a dead man. You see, it's to say, I'm not going to reason about that because I haven't got an answer to it, and that's just uncomfortable. But you see, these are philosophical questions which not just Christians, by the way, but all philosophers have had to ask and face throughout the centuries. Dr. Stein doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of giving us an answer how an atheist worldview can account for laws. Laws of science, laws of logic, laws of morality. And yet he does tell us without them, science would be impossible. As for the transcendental argument not being logical, I mean, you can claim that, but I've yet to see Dr. Stein show any self-contradiction or any violation of the laws of logic in it. And of course, if he were, I would immediately ask him if that law of logic is one of the things that we are necessarily to live according to. Are we to reason by this law? Or is that just a convention? Should I say, well, it's your convention, but it's not mine? Or is that law of logic universal invariant and something that must be followed if we're going to arrive at truth? If it is, I'm going to ask him how it's possible to have such a thing in his universe, how he can justify it at all. But he hasn't shown any contradiction. He simply, again, called it illogical. Whether it's falsifiable or not, I mean, even asking that question, I think, shows that Dr. Stein is not really aware of the philosophical nature of the question and debate before us. No, transcendentals are not falsifiable. That's right, but they are very meaningful, the very sorts of things that philosophers deal with all the time. You look at Kant or Aristotle or other philosophers, you'll see they deal with the preconditions of experience. And since they are the preconditions of experience, they are not falsifiable, and yet they are meaningful. He says that I do not have an answer to these questions either. Well, I certainly do. It's just he doesn't like the answer. The answer is that God created the world. And this world reflects the uniformity that he imposes on it by his governing, and our thinking is to reflect the same consistency or logical coherence that is in God's thinking. How do we learn about those things? He revealed himself to us. Again, these are simple answers and the sorts of things Sunday school children learn, but I've yet to find any reason not to believe them. For Dr. Stein to say, well, these aren't answers, doesn't convince me at all. He says, there aren't going to be answers unless I include how it took place. What is God's method and why did he do it? Well, I don't accept those standards. I don't accept that that's a requirement for an explanation at all. And he doesn't give us any good reason except that he's not going to be satisfied or it's unhelpful to him. He says it's a non-meaningful statement to say that the laws of logic reflect the thinking of God. He wants to know things like, can God be irrational? Well, if you had asked those questions in cross-examination, I'd answer them. No, God cannot be irrational. Rationality is measured by the standard of his thinking and his revelation. The atheist worldview cannot account for the laws of logic, cannot account for any universal or abstract entities for that matter, cannot account for the uniformity of nature, and therefore cannot account for the successes of science. Nor can the atheist universe give us universal and absolute laws of morality. And so on three of the most important issues philosophically that men must face, logic, science, and morality, the atheist universe is completely at odds with those things. Well, we have 1 minute left here. I want to answer very quickly those few things that Dr. Stein brought up in his second presentation so that I might rebut them. He wants to know about the problem of evil. My answer to the problem of evil is this. There is no problem of evil in an atheist universe because there is no evil in an atheist universe. Since there's no God, there's no absolute moral standard, and nothing is wrong. The torture of little children is not wrong in an atheist universe. It may be painful, but it is not wrong. It is morally wrong in a theistic universe, and therefore there is a problem of evil of perhaps a psychological or emotional sort. But philosophically, the answer to the problem of evil is you don't have an absolute standard of good by which to measure evil in an atheist universe. You only have that in a theistic universe, and therefore the very posing of the problem presupposes my worldview rather than his own. God has a good reason for the evil that he plans or allows.
Thank you, Dr. Bonson. We have now concluded segment number 2 of this evening's debate, and we will move very quickly into segment number 3, which is closing statement. Dr. Stein has the first closing statement, which will be of a 10-minute duration.
Dr. Bonson, in his last response, and indeed throughout his entire talk, has made a number of claims about what's possible in an atheist universe and what is not possible in an atheist universe. All I can say is that he has a very strange conception of an atheist universe and perhaps of the universe in general. First of all, evil in an atheist universe. Yes, indeed, there can be evil in an atheist universe. Evil is, by definition, in an atheist universe, that which decreases the happiness of people, the most unhappiness of people. In other words, if we have two things that, if we want to make a comparative evil statement, which is more evil than another, the thing is more evil, which causes more people to be unhappy. Now, how do we know this? Well, we don't know it. It's a consensus, just like morality in general is a consensus. It's a consensus reinforced by the teachings of society through its parents to children, teachers to students, the media, literature, the Bible. All of these things reinforce morality through teaching and the socialization process. And also we pass laws to punish people that violate some of the more blatant cases that we have said are no-nos. So the idea that there's no evil in an atheist universe is utter hogwash. But our evil is at least a rational, determinate thing. We don't say, well, did God make this evil? And then we have to go flipping through the Bible to see if it was covered at all. You know, there's 100 volumes of commentary, at least 100 volumes more, called the Talmud, which is the Jews' interpretation of all the places that the Old Testament didn't give them any guidance on for ethical and moral issues. So, I mean, these things are not clearly spelled out in the Bible. We have no guidance on a lot of things as to what's evil. Is ovum transplant evil? I mean, you don't find that in your Bible. You've got to go and look at the issues, and you do an analysis just the way any rational philosopher would do it, or what do you call that person? An ethicist. Couldn't think of the word. So, I mean, we have standards by which we determine evil and good, and in an atheistic world, the atheistic world view, I think I've demonstrated that the regularity of matter, which is an inherent property of matter, explains that the way we are able to make laws which are generalizations in the field of science. And to say that, first of all, many scientists are atheists. It's been shown by studies over and over again. So they claim, as Dr. Bonson claims to claim, that science
doesn't give us an atheistic worldview that is in conformity with, that science is not in conformity with an atheistic worldview, is utter nonsense. Science is in itself atheistic. It doesn't use God to explain things, and it understands that matter behaves in a regular and therefore a predictable way. And that is the way in which scientific research is done. The same with logic. Logic is a consensus. I think it has a mathematical and a linguistic basis. It has some conformity to the reality of the world. I don't know how many times we have to repeat that for it to get through to Dr. Bonson, but it doesn't seem to be. And he seems to specialize in what we call the thinking makes it so school of logic, if you want to call it that. Because he says something is so, because he knows what God's thinking was, therefore it is so. The omniscient Dr. Bonson has answered. Well, that doesn't answer anything if we're going to apply the test of reason to what he says. His statements are not only irrational, they are unreasonable. The idea that the future is going to be like the past, it's a statistical probability statement. We have never seen a future. Today is the future from yesterday. And yesterday, what is happening today was the future. And we have not seen anything in that time period that we have observed, which is several hundred years, to show that the regularity of matter and its behavior is going to change. If it changes, scientific experiments will go haywire, and we'll know it right off the bat. And then we'll have to revise a lot of things. I think the chances of that happening are pretty small. Now, let me just finish by saying that atheism is not a bleak and negative concept. It frees man, it sweeps away the theological debris that has prevented man from taking action to correct the problems of this world. We want to feed the hungry, we want to educate the illiterate, we want to clothe the naked, we want to raise the standard of living, we want to spread reason and thinking and progress and science. These are all things which are in and of themselves atheistic. We don't do them because God tells us to do them. We do them because they're right. They need to be done in this world. And if we do them because they're right and make people happy, we will be made happy ourselves by making other people happy. It's a very positive world outlook. It's something which I don't think Dr. Bonson has even mentioned, but it's certainly the other side of the coin. I mean, what happens when you wipe away the God concept? Are you left with nothing? No, you're left with the responsibility that you have to take on yourself. You are responsible for your actions, and also you get the credit for the things that you do. And I would rather have a realistic worldview that gives up a few things that will be nice to have but just don't happen to be true. And I'd rather operate on a worldview like that than I would on making wish fulfillment of things that just are not so.
Thank you, Dr. Stein. Dr. Bonson, your 10-minute closing statement, please.
I want to begin my closing statement by thanking the debate team for inviting both Dr. Stein and myself here for this interesting evening and interchange, and thank you all for giving up an evening to discuss what I consider a very important question. And I thank Dr. Stein for coming and for his graciousness toward me. As far as my my closing statement, I need to deal, I think, first of all, perhaps in the entire time, analyzing this remark that my statements have been tonight irrational. Well, perhaps they have. But if you're saying so doesn't make it so. That's something we just heard as well. And so if my statements have been irrational, then we're going to need some standards of reasoning by which these statements have been shown to be irrational. Dr. Stein has yet to explain to us, in even the broadest, simplest Sunday school child manner that I told you about laws of logic, laws of science, and laws of morality, he hasn't even begun to scratch the surface to tell us how, in his worldview, there can be laws of any sort. And if there can't be laws or standards in his worldview, then he can't worry about my irrationality, my alleged irrationality. The transcendental argument for the existence of God has not been answered by Dr. Stein. It's been evaded, it's been made fun of, but it hasn't been answered. And that's what we're here for, rational interchange. The transcendental argument says the proof of the Christian God is that without him you can't prove anything. Notice, the argument does not say that atheists don't prove things. The argument doesn't say that atheists don't use logic, science, or laws of morality. In fact, they do. The argument is that their worldview cannot account for what they are doing. Their worldview is not consistent with what they are doing. In their worldview, there are no laws, there are no abstract entities, there are no universal, there are no prescriptions. There's just the material universe, naturalistically explained in the way things happen to be. That's not law-like or universal, and therefore the worldview doesn't account for logic, science, or morality. But atheists, of course, use logic, science, and morality. And in so doing, atheists give continual evidence of the fact that in their heart of hearts they aren't atheists. In their heart of hearts, they know the God I'm talking about. This God made them. This God reveals himself continually to them through the natural order, through their conscience, and through their very use of reason. They know this God, and they suppress the truth about him. One of the ways we see that they suppress the truth about him is because they do continue to use laws of logic, science, and morality, though their worldview cannot account for them. Dr. Stein has said the laws of logic are merely conventional. If so, then on convention, he wins tonight's debate. On convention, I win tonight's debate. And if you're satisfied with that, you didn't need to come in the first place. You expected the laws of logic to be applied as universal standards of rationality. Rationality is not possible in a universe that just consigns them to convention. Dr. Stein said the laws of science are law-like because of the inherent character of matter. But Dr. Stein doesn't know the inherent character of matter. Now, if you were God, you might reveal that to us, as I think God has revealed certain things to us about the operation of the universe. But he's not God. He doesn't even believe there is a God. Since he hasn't experienced all the instances of matter and all of the electron reactions, all the other things scientists look at, since he hasn't experienced all of those, he doesn't know that those things are universal. He doesn't know that the future is going to be like the past. When he says, it always has been in the past, and boy, if it changes tomorrow, won't that make the front pages? That's not an answer. You see, we're asking, what justifies your proceeding on the expectation that the future is like the past? To say, well, it's always been that way in the past, is just to beg the question. We want to know on what basis your worldview allows for the uniformity of nature and laws of science. Thirdly, we've spoken of laws of morality tonight. He says they have laws of morality. The utilitarian standard of what brings the greatest happiness to the greatest number. Well, that doesn't justify utilitarianism to announce it. He's announced that it's a standard. But why in an atheist universe should we live by that standard? Marquis de Sade enjoyed torturing women. Now, why should he give up torturing women so that he might bring greater happiness to those women that he was torturing? Now, I've got an answer for that. It's not one that Dr. Stein likes, and maybe some of you out there don't like it, but at least I can begin philosophically to deal with it. I have an answer. A universal absolute about morality. Dr. Stein does not. He simply has an announced, stipulated standard. And if morality can be stipulated, then, of course, Marquis de Sade can stipulate his own, even if Dr. Stein has stipulated his own. Why should he feed the poor? He says they want to do that. I grant that. My argument tonight has never been that atheists are the lousiest people in the world. That's not the point. Some Christians can be pretty lousy too. But why is it that I call atheists or Christians lousy when they act in the ways that we're thinking of? Because I have absolute standards of morality to judge. Dr. Stein does not. And therefore, once again, from a transcendental standpoint, the atheistic worldview cannot account for this debate tonight. Because this debate tonight has assumed that we're going to use the laws of logic as standards of reasoning, or else we're irrational. So we're going to use laws of science. We're going to be intelligent men that way. We're going to assume induction and causation and all those things that scientists do, and it's assumed moral stance. So we're not going to be dishonest and try to lie or just try to deceive you. I mean, if there aren't laws of morality, I could just take out a gun right now and say, okay, Dr. Stein, make my day. Is there a God or not? You see, if he argues, oh no, you can't murder me because there are laws of morality, then of course he's made my day because I won the debate. That shows that the atheist universe is not correct. But if he says, oh no, there are no absolute standards, it's all by convention and stipulation, that sort of thing, then I just pull the trigger and it's all over and I win the debate anyway. Would you expect me to win the debate in that fashion? Absolutely not. You came here expecting rational interchange. I don't think we've heard much from Dr. Stein. I've asked him repeatedly, it's very simple, I don't want a lot of details, just begin to scratch the surface. How, in a materialistic, naturalistic outlook on life, man in his place in the world, can you account for laws of logic, laws of science, and laws of morality? The atheist worldview cannot do it, and therefore I feel justified in concluding, as I did my opening presentation this evening, by saying that the proof of the Christian God is the impossibility of the contrary. Without the Christian worldview, this debate wouldn't make sense. The Bible tells us, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Don't misunderstand that. When the Bible uses the term fool, it's not engaging in name-calling. It's trying to describe somebody who is dense, in the sense that they will not use his reason as God has given it. Somebody who is rebellious, who is hard-hearted. It's the fool who says in his heart, there is no God. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians, the first chapter, that God has made foolish the wisdom of this world. He calls rhetorically, where is the wise? Where is the disputer or the debater of this age? Hasn't God made foolish the wisdom of this world? In a sense, I think what Paul is telling us, if I can amplify and read between the lines, is the whole history of philosophy is an argument for the existence of God. The whole history of philosophy is an argument for the existence of God because of the impossibility of the contrary. Someone who wants to say contrary to what the Bible says about God, let him stand up and answer these questions. Let him show that in his heart he may say there is no God, but he can't live that way. He can't reason that way. In Romans, the first chapter, Paul says God is making himself known continually to all men and persuasively, so that men do not have an excuse for the rejection of the existence of the Christian God. That isn't to say that all men confess this God. Not all will own up to him as their heavenly Father. Not all will submit to him. Some continue to rebel. Some continue to devise their fool's errands and rationalizations for why they don't have to believe in him. That's what the Bible teaches. I didn't come here and make this up. I didn't come here tonight to say, well, if you don't agree, you see, you're just being rebellious. That's what the Bible says. What I want you to do tonight is to go home and to consider whether there isn't something to that. Why is it that some people continue to use laws of logic, laws of morality, laws of science, and yet they have a worldview that just clashes with that, and they just won't do anything to resolve contradiction? Dr. Stein tonight made reference to my doctoral dissertation on self-deception. He wondered how relevant it might be. Well, it's very relevant. It's very relevant. Because what I do in that doctoral dissertation is to show that there are some people who know the truth and yet work very hard to convince themselves that it's not true. Now, of course, atheists think that's what Christians are doing. I recognize that, and we have to argue what the evidence for and against self-deception is. All I want to leave with you tonight is the fact that self-deception is a real phenomenon. It does happen to people. People who know the truth can yet work very hard to rationalize the evidence, convince themselves, as Paul says, suppress the truth in unrighteousness, convince themselves that there is no God. Well, you can choose tonight between the Christian worldview, the atheist worldview. We haven't touched all of the issues that you may want to look into, but in broad strokes, we have touched on a very important issue. If you're going to be a rational man, a moral man, a man of science, can you do so in an atheist universe? I say you can.
Thank you, Dr. Bonson.
Hey, Matt. Well, that concludes the formal part of the debate. Segment 4 in the transcript is the Q&A time, and I encourage you to read and listen to that at some point. But I thought we'd take the last 10 minutes or so and discuss what we've heard, or if you have questions from the prior 18 sessions of this series, something that's been bothering you, or we can talk about that. Vernon. I just anticipated you raising your hand.
I was just wondering, his argument for the reason for the laws of science and so forth and observation of material, isn't that kind of putting the carriage before the horse? Is that what Bonson was trying to kind of point out to him, that you're saying that you look at, cause and effect in nature, and you're saying that's why we say this is a law? Is that?
Will you say your question differently?
Does Stein have a point in the way that he tries to interpret the laws of nature and science through observation?
Does he have a point that supports his position?
That position.
Well, the weakness is it's not a law. If it's his personal experience that's based on observation, and unless he is omniscient, then we can't take what he's saying about nature, that it is uniform, as law. Because he's, which in itself is very problematic, because no one here is observing the past. Try to test your memory. I'd like to see someone explain how they do that.
And like Boston said, we could wake up tomorrow and, gravity could be that way,
Right.
It could be, if we had not, that, like you said, we don't know someone who knows everything, who told us that it's always going to be this way.
Yeah. All the scientists and engineers around the world every day are behaving like Christian theists. If they, the alternative is, it just.
So they are using law.
Yes, they're
The laws.
assuming a law.
But they're borrowing from the Christian world.
Right.
That's right.
He's saying you can't even, you're arguing here, so you're already winning my point for me. Thanks.
Very good.
Have a nice day.
Yeah, he says in one of his lectures about this debate that by showing up to the debate, Dr. Stein, you lost.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's why his statement that a pagan cannot know anything is that the only way that they're able to have laws and use laws is because they're borrowing from the Christian worldview. So
Yeah.
if they were not to borrow from the Christian worldview, they would not know anything.
Right. Yeah.
Now they can know, but they have no foundation for it.
Yes, and thus we should challenge their claim to know. Yeah. Lucas, did you have a?
Well, we were talking about probability. They don't even behave as if what they say about probabilities is true, because they're claiming the sun's going to rise tomorrow. It's really a probability that there's a very, very, very small chance that it won't,
All right.
just because it always has. But wouldn't it be true that since whatever recorded history is, it always has, that the very, very small probability is growing larger every day that it does? And so, by if their own system, then the probability the sun won't rise tomorrow should be growing every day, and they're not behaving like that.
I like that.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. Very good. You must have went to law school. Yes, Susan.
So just thinking about the problem of evil and his definition, the utilitarian definitions, how something is evil if it decreases your happiness.
Utilitarianism, yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
I'm thinking, I was just reading an article about the increase incarcerated people, the great number of incarcerated people. Wouldn't that constitute a mass, and wouldn't be decreasing their happiness by keeping them incarcerated? Therefore, we should let them out because that would decrease their happiness.
Well, there's, at least in my studies, there's two types of utilitarianism. There's the greatest good for the greatest number of people, and that's what we generally follow. At least that's what he said we follow and we should follow.
What is the other one?
The greatest level of happiness, and so if my level of happiness would exceed all of yours, then you should all bow to that which gives me the greatest level of happiness.
Is that where you get into, as long as it makes the individual happy and it's not necessarily hurting anybody else? Is that where that kind of gets mixed into there? For justification of worldviews or lifestyles or whatever. Oh, well, I'm not hurting anybody, physically.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
But it makes me happy, so it's kind of like the greater good.
That's right. Yeah.
Are you saying like your level? So if you have a utopian view of everyone, no murders in society, right? And your level, so you're saying if all of our level is lower than your level because you're trying to destroy all murders in society by putting a chip in people's head that they can't, kill. Is that what you mean by level? I guess when you said your level of happiness can be higher than all of our level of happiness.
I think defining what that is would be really hard. How would you quantify my level being higher than yours? I'm just saying what I understand people.
Like mine versus yours.
Yeah.
Mhm.
How my word be- that's a whole other-
You mean the standard?
Yes, Dan.
That would be my interpretation versus yours. Yours doesn't agree with mine, so yours isn't worth it.
Yeah, that sort of ethic just boils down to a relativism.
Not worrying about other people's happiness, they're worrying about their own.
Uh-huh.
It's all about me first, and everybody else has to either follow mine or they're wrong.
And that's what some have thought, and that's how some have acted. And if there are no moral absolutes, then no one's rationally justified to decry that sort of behavior on the part of a tyrant. You know, if Hitler wants to slaughter Jews because it makes him happy, and it, you know, in a sense he was being consistent. It didn't make him happy. He thought he was doing good for the world to get rid of these nasty Jews who are weighing down society. Yes. Did you have a question?
I guess I would simplify it down to, if he was asking the question because they were debating Christianity and atheism, what is it about Jesus Christ that you dislike so much? That you would debate or turn around? What about him? Because that's the whole crux of what we believe. What is it? Because when you get right down to, I guess what I'm trying to say is when you get right down to the individual
Mm-hmm.
and what he believes or what he doesn't, we already know what the Word of God says. His heart's darkened. He's a dead man.
Mm-hmm.
He can't see, he can't hear, he can't speak because he's spiritually dead. So after listening to it, I kind of came down to, what's your real reason for hating the Lord Jesus Christ? What is it about the Lord Jesus Christ that you take an affront to?
That leads you to go and debate before 1,000 students.
Yes. Well, we already know why he thinks the way he does.
Yeah.
The Word already tells us. God gave them over to, he darkened their heart because they chose to reject him.
Well,
And that's from Romans on down.
I think a reason for that is the same. You could say the same for Dr. Bonson. Dr. Bonson has a drive, a passion, a love for the Lord Jesus Christ. Dr. Stein and other unbelievers have a drive and a passion and a love for their deity, their idol. And when you begin to assault their deity, it infuriates them, just like it infuriates us. We have a righteous indignation toward those who blaspheme God, who say falsehoods about the Lord. And so we're willing to lay down our life for that, aren't we? We take a bullet for it. We better. And such is the case for at least Dr. Stein and others.
It's not so much the arguing, but I guess the way in which, because anything that he comes at, what was I'm sorry, how do you pronounce the Christian's name, Dr.
Bonson?
Bonson?
Mhm.
Dr. Bonson, he's never going to be right. I mean, it's never, from Dr. Stein's point of view, it's never going to be reasonable.
Sure.
Because from last week, he wanted reasonable, but his reason is you're never going to reason with anything. So I guess I would just get to the crux of it. It's really the Lord Jesus Christ because that's who we say is God. That's who raises us up under the light. That's why we get the Spirit. I guess it's more of the direction of the heart.
Well, I think that Dr. Bonson, at the end of his closing statement, was attempting to highlight these things, that what's really going on here is a suppression of God in unrighteousness.
And who we believe to be God, who is the Lord Jesus Christ.
That's why, from the very get-go, Bonson was quick to point out, I'm arguing for Christian theism.
What would have happened if you'd have asked Dr. Stein, why do you hate Jesus so much?
Well, I would anticipate him saying, I don't hate him, because he's ignorant of the scriptures that says you're either for me.
There's quite a number of humanists that say Jesus was a good man.
Sure.
They don't know what a good man is, but
Right. Did everybody hear what Larry said? There are a lot of people who give feigned praise to Jesus.
yeah, I thought, when he chapter, God is making himself known continually. He was preaching the gospel,
Yeah.
Mr. Stein.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And I mean, in the end, after the argument is over and the man is hardened already, be a proclaimer. You never know, the seed's been planted.
Yeah, and that's why I like with Jason Mullenbelt. You know, we have a lot in common. I wanted to discuss these long-standing philosophical issues with him, but as Cynthia will tell you, when we sat down, one of my questions was, explain the gospel to me in a minute. Just tell me what you know, because he and I could have talked for days about interesting things and important things, but I didn't have that time with him, and hopefully we'll get together again, have dinner or something. But I wanted to see, have you ever even heard the gospel?
Would you say, Tony, there's a biblical mandate? The Bible says, answer a fool according to his folly. And there is a benefit and there is a purpose to showing the unbeliever the illogical nature of his thinking, from the standpoint of, having this debate, having this discussion with them, even though they might not want to recognize it. I think even people in the crowd, by God's grace, of course, start to realize that the atheistic worldview is irrational and it doesn't have a foundation. But yet we as Christians know that the argument is not going to win the battle. It's the Spirit of God that's going to convict the heart.
Which
Yeah.
goes with the gospel.
Right.
Yes, there's a lot of thoughts there. All of us as Christians are tempted to sin, right? And a lot of the ways that we're tempted to sin is intellectually. It's not always an outward, gross expression with our hand. And one of the ways that we're tempted, especially younger Christians in schools and universities, is to replace Christian philosophy of life, Colossians 2, with the pagan philosophy of life. And so it's a great benefit to learn the unbelieving worldviews, to hear them presented to you, because it will hopefully inoculate you to a greater degree in being tempted to replace the Lord Jesus with them, even in the smallest part. Because we're all probably here inconsistent a little bit, and if you adopt some form of utilitarianism, which is what we talked about a moment ago, that's not good. And so if you know about utilitarianism and you see it, you go, that doesn't please the Lord Jesus if I were to adopt that. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm.
And it got down to, why would God let babies die, with baby stuff like that? That was from his personal experience. And of course, I gave all the, biblical answers, the scripture and everything. Finally, the Lord went, after coming to argue with me, I finally looked at my dad and I said, how many babies have you saved? How many babies have you saved? And I never had that argument again.
Yeah, and you could have said, what's the need to rescue the babies anyway if there's not a God who's prescribed a way to behave? Just kill them all.
But he wasn't coming, that wasn't his argument. He wasn't coming from that angle.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? He wasn't coming from his own rationale so much as
Why should he worship the Lord?
why should I believe this?
There's babies dying, and
Reason to believe in God. It wasn't coming exactly from the same direction that Stein was coming. It's the same question.
Mhm.
Give me a reason to believe in the God that you say you worship.
yeah.
Believe in it.
And we give them reasons. In fact, the reason that we give them, ultimately, the transcendental argument, is a necessary truth that makes their arguing against us rational. But we all know that, as Randy pointed out, unless the Spirit convicts them, they're going to reject it. Well, it's time to end the class. Thank you very much for the past 19 weeks of being here And I hope this was of some benefit to you, and we'll, Lord willing, have some